All right, good afternoon. I welcome you to this Deep Cuts Commission briefing on the NATO summit and the bilateral US-Russian summit, all taking place next week. My name is Oliver Meier. I'm senior researcher with the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg, and I'm speaking to you from our Berlin office. IFSH, together with the Arms Control Association and IMEMO in Moscow, coordinates the Deep Cuts Commission, which is a trilateral group of experts from the United States, Russia, and Germany. The group has been working together for quite a long time. The project was established in 2013, 8 years ago, and collectively we participate in and try to contribute to the wider debate on arms control. This project has been supported throughout the years by the German Federal Foreign Office. And I mention that up front because such long-term support is unfortunately quite rare these days. And we're very grateful that we were able to work together and continue to be able to work together in this group. We contribute to the debate on arms control by publishing research papers and statements, and by organizing such briefings on relevant developments. And we have two of these developments actually ahead of us next week. And the Commission has just released a statement on how the NATO summit, which will take place a week from now, and the Geneva summit between Presidents Biden and Putin might help to turn the tide on nuclear arms control. In the statement, the Commission recommends that NATO allies, when they meet in Brussels, will and should support the Biden administration's call for reducing the role of nuclear weapons by declaring that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is the deterrence of nuclear attacks. We recommend that all types of nuclear weapons should be included in the bilateral nuclear arms control agenda. And we recommend that Presidents Biden and Putin, when they meet in Geneva, agree on a regular and intensive series of strategic stability talks to address military imbalances and practices that increase the risk of miscalculation and conflict. And the Commission also calls on both presidents to announce that they will soon launch new bilateral nuclear arms control negotiations aimed at securing a follow-on agreement to the New START Treaty, which both sides have just extended for another 5 years. And we also call on both sides to declare a moratorium on the development of new nuclear weapon capabilities. You can find the full Commission statement with more recommendations and analysis online. The link has just been posted in the chat, and I look forward to discussing these and related issues over the next hour with 3 leading experts and 3 members of the Deep Cuts Commission who are with us today from Monterey, where it's still early morning, so thanks for getting up so early to do this. Sarah Bidgood, who directs the Eurasia Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies from Moscow. Andrei Zagorski is joining us, who is head of the Department of Disarmament and Conflict Resolution at IMEMO and professor at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, also known as IMGIMO. And from Berlin, happy to have Ambassador Walter Schmid with us, who was ambassador with residence in Moscow at a crucial time for nuclear arms control, 2005, 2010, and who also was Deputy Commissioner and Commissioner of the German federal government for disarmament and arms control. So 3 experts who are uniquely able to analyze the developments and look ahead from 3 different perspectives to tell us what we might want to expect and what we should expect from the 2 summits from a US, from a Russian, from a European perspective. And before I give the floor to them, 2 necessary remarks on the ground rules for this meeting. This is an on-the-record meeting. We're actually taping it. We will post it on the Deep Cuts Commission website afterwards. And during and following the briefing, we will collect your questions via the chat function, which is open already. So I invite you to submit your questions and comments if you want in the chat function. My colleague Maren Filov, who's working with me in the Deep Cuts Commission, will help me to pull these questions together, and I will then try to put them forward to our 3 speakers after their brief remarks. But enough from me at this point, and I'm happy to hand over to Sarah, who will tell us from a US perspective what we can expect from the Biden administration of these 2 meetings. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Oliver, and thank you again to all colleagues. It's really a pleasure to be on a panel for such an important and timely discussion this morning. So I'm going to center my remarks around sort of what we know about the US administration's position on arms control and strategic stability going into these summits, and particularly this June 16th summit in Geneva between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin. And I'm going to keep my introductory remarks here pretty narrowly focused on these 2 issues, although obviously I think we all know that there are a range of sort of non-proliferation challenges as well that would really benefit from US and Russian coordination. And of course, those include sort of the future of US participation in the JCPOA, prospects for US and Russian cooperation on the NPT review process, but I'm going to set those aside for now and happy to delve in if there are questions in Q&A. So the first thing I do think I'll note here is that my characterization this morning is going to be a little bit speculative, since the new administration hasn't yet conducted its reviews of its nuclear posture or policy. I would expect to have a clearer picture of its positions with respect to a number of the issues that we're going to highlight here following, of course, the completion of the nuclear posture review, which recent testimony from DoD officials suggests will begin soon and will continue in the summer and fall. But until then, one of the documents that we can draw upon is the Biden administration's interim National Security Strategic Guidance, which was released in March of this year. And if you read through that document, you'll see that its contents are necessarily sort of fairly general, but it does offer some clues about where the administration's priorities lie with respect to its views on both arms control and strategic stability with Russia, which I think are topical for our conversation this morning. One of the central themes that comes through for me when I read this document is the simultaneous importance of both sort of heading off costly arms races, future arms races, while also reestablishing the US's credibility as a leader in arms control. So that's something that's emphasized in that document. And specifically, it notes that, and I'm going to quote here, the United States will take steps to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in its national security strategy, while also engaging in meaningful dialogue with Russia and China on a range of emerging military technological developments that implicate strategic stability. And Lenore Tomro, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy, underscored both of these priorities again in recent testimony that she gave before the Senate Armed Services Committee. And she added in that context that the upcoming nuclear posture review would include what she referred to as a renewed focus on strategic stability to include risk reduction and arms control. So from this, I can kind of glean, both from her testimony and from the interim national security strategic guidance, that there's a reaffirmation of the importance of building upon the foundation laid by the extension of the New START Treaty with arms control arrangements where possible, which can help to increase transparency and predictability in the US-Russian relationship at a time when I think that's really necessary. Of course, one of the biggest unknowns, for us from the outside looking in is what such a follow-on agreement might look like. And we know a little bit from the US representative to the Conference on Disarmament, who indicated in mid-May that the US would be looking to use the 5 years afforded by the extension of the New START Treaty to pursue, and I'll quote again here, arms control that addresses all Russian nuclear weapons, including novel strategic systems and non-strategic nuclear weapons. That's not necessarily news in and of itself, since it does echo what Secretary of State Blinken noted in his remarks on the extension of New START back in February. But I think it's worth pointing out that this sort of a treaty of this scope continues to be a consistently articulated objective, despite what I think can be described as increasing tension in the US and Russian relationship, over the last several months in the beginning part of this year. This continued commitment to arms control also appears to be consistent with what we know about the administration's stated approach to Moscow. So to use their language, they're seeking to both hold Russia to account for adversarial actions, while also engaging in efforts to reduce the potential for crisis and conflict. And of course, that's a difficult line to walk, especially while making sure that both parties remain at the negotiating table. And it also means that it's going to be really important for the administration to continue to reassure allies in Europe at the same time. And we see that as a continued focus in recent statements from US officials, including President Biden's recent op-ed in the Washington Post, which was just released, I think yesterday, very recently. Another big unknown is the extent to which the current US administration will continue to support the previous administration's nuclear modernization plans. That's not really the focus of my remarks this morning. We're sort of thinking more about strategic stability and arms control in Washington and what those positions look like. But it does matter whether the United States plans, for example, to continue with the development of the ground-based strategic deterrent or the next generation interceptor program, because I think that can have an influence on the scope of what is possible in future negotiations on a bilateral basis with Russia. And at least rhetorically, the Biden administration has spoken frequently about the need for a nuclear posture that is appropriate to the current economic environment, which we know is quite austere. And again, to quote from this interim national security strategy guidance, the US is prepared to shift our emphasis from unneeded legacy platforms and weapon systems to free up resources for investments in what it describes as cutting edge technologies and capabilities that will determine our military and national security advantage in the future. At the same time, though, it's also clear that a priority for this administration is maintaining the safety, security, and credibility of the US strategic and extended deterrence. And the president's budget request for 2022, I think, reflects this priority. It would invest $27 billion to modernize all three legs of the nuclear triad. And of course, we don't know yet what the end result of that budget and appropriations process is going to look like, but those statements and that kind of budget provide some context clues about what the scope of future negotiations could look like. So I'll be interested to hear from my co-panelists and perhaps others who are on the line today about how that's being interpreted and understood in foreign capitals. So my remarks this morning, which I'll keep very brief per Oliver's guidance, have focused on sort of what I think we can glean preliminarily from official statements leading up to particularly this June 16th summit. But just before I wrap up, I do want to identify a few important areas where I'm very much in a wait and see mode, but which I think will be important for understanding what the landscape looks like in the future. So first and foremost, we've heard both Russian and American officials, I think, talk about the importance of risk reduction, talk about that as an area where there could potentially be fruitful ground for cooperation, but I really don't have a sense for what that looks like in a concrete way. So I'll be very interested to see, partly what comes out of the US nuclear posture review and whether there are areas of overlap there with Russian declaratory policy to see whether there could be some areas for cooperation. I also don't have a great deal of clarity into what sort of might be possible in terms of reinvigorating past or existing arms control agreements. So I mentioned, the JCPOA at the outset, which is obviously a non-proliferation agreement, but what about things like the CTBT? Are there prospects there for some reinvigorated discussion, potential cooperation as we have seen in the past? And then last but not least, I'm really interested to see what types and formats of agreements or confidence building measures the Biden administration might be interested in pursuing with Russia. So we've been sort of talking here, I think, about verifiable treaty-based arms control, but in keeping with some of my own research interests, I'm curious to know whether unilateral measures might be possible as well, or whether there's something that is not exactly treaty-based, but is still an agreement that could play a role in shoring up strategic stability in the coming months with Russia. So obviously we're not going to know any of that before June 16th, which is coming up really soon, but we might by the fall. And so those are some of the topics that I think could be usefully examined at a future briefing like this. So Oliver, I've tried to keep it short. I'll turn it back over to you now and perhaps to other colleagues as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. That was very concise and good picture of how the Biden administration is going into this trip to Europe. There's a G7 summit ahead of the two summits also. So it's actually a series of 3 summits, but I think the 2 ones next week are probably from an arms control perspective, the ones that are the most important ones. So Andrei, I can just pass on Sarah's question to you and ask you, from a perspective, from a Moscow perspective, what do you think would be the Russian response to the kind of agenda that Sarah outlined, focusing on risk reduction, asking for inclusion of all Russian nuclear weapons? I'd be very interested to hear what your assessment is on where we are and where Moscow might want to go, particularly with the Geneva summit. Over to you.
Thank you, Oliver. Hello, everybody. Let me raise a few quick points. Although our commission is very much focused on the nuclear arms control issues, let me begin by something which is not exactly nuclear arms control, but this is, I think, an important point related specifically to the upcoming NATO summit meeting. To what extent, my question will be, to what extent NATO would or would not begin opening toward beginning to talk to Russia on conventional arms control. We have seen recently in the statement, and there is one more summit meeting upcoming in a few days, and it is going to be a summit meeting of the G7. And in May, the foreign ministers of the G7 countries have included arms control in general, not only nuclear arms control, on the very, very short list of issues on which they were prepared to engage with Russia. So my question is whether or not we will see some consequences of this movement in the NATO summit, and whether or not we can count that we gradually will come back to the arms control talks between NATO and Russia, not reduced only to raising the question of confidence building measures, but also looking at some hard arms control issues. My second point on the US-Russia summit meeting. As Sarah has mentioned, with respect to the US policy, there are many open questions on the Russian side as well. Not very much is leaked into the media because it's a very, very dense communication process preparing for the summit meeting. As far as I understand, the diplomats on both sides work very intensely on drafting the joint statement, which may come up maybe the result of this meeting. And this may be the major document to be approved, if at all. That's also an open question so far. We will see at the end. I'd wished myself, of course, that with respect to the nuclear arms control, we could have at the outcome of the Putin-Biden meeting a joint statement similar to the one which Presidents Yeltsin and Clinton had adopted in 1997, outlining the parameters for continued or future nuclear arms control. Which was not very detailed, but at least which was providing a guidance in which direction. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. It's all right now. And there was a short hiccup, but you're good now. So please continue.
My connection. Okay, 1997. It was not very specific, but it was providing the guidance for the future talks on nuclear arms control. I'm not sure that this time Putin and Biden will be able to be that specific. And this is a bridge to my third point, because today we not simply begin with after a break in communications between the US and Russia, but also because the whole issue is getting much more complex. I may remind you that the issue and agenda is not just nuclear arms control, but the issue is strategic stability. And we do have different, sometimes divergent understanding of what strategic stability means today. but definitely it is no longer reduced or limited to strategic nuclear arms control only, as it was in the 1990s or even in 2009 when the New START was signed. These days, we discuss new factors which do impact on the strategic stability or which may impact on the strategic stability in the future, such as ballistic missile defenses, such as long-range conventional strike capabilities, such as eventual developments in the outer space, or even cyber. So it's, we do have different views on how to combine these things. And it may be difficult to move ahead with nuclear arms control without having at least some kind of understanding on what we include, what we don't include on the strategic stability, at least today. And on the Russian side, of course, definitely Russia is eager to include all those issues which I have mentioned on the agenda of the strategic stability talks. Whether or not it would be an issue of including everything into one treaty is an open question. We may have parallel but interrelated paths of discussing about different issues. Diplomats will see at the end of the day what would be part of which kind of instruments which may be negotiated in this way. But certainly Russia sees the whole subject much more comprehensively than the US does. On the other side, we see that we will see what would be the final position of the US, but we've heard repeatedly that, and this is not new, that the US would like to discuss, to put all the nuclear weapons on the table. And this is something which we do have in the statement by the Deep Cuts Commission, which was released today. Whether or not everything would be in one treaty is still an open issue. And we do see some potential for compromises between including all nuclear weapons into one instrument and including other elements of strategic stability as a potential outcome. But this is all very open so far. So I will end by simply saying this is going to be the first meeting in which the presidents will exchange, and their teams do exchange on those issues, which hopefully will bring us closer to the common understanding of what is on the table, what is not, and what might be the secrets, or what might be the different instruments to be negotiated. This is why this meeting is going to be very important. And at least the presidents will be supposed to provide some initial guidance for their teams to continue these talks, because we don't have much time to do so. We have extended the New START until 2026, but in 2024, we are going to have presidential elections both in the US and Russia. That means we must come up with some product at the end, no later than at the end of 2023. And this leaves us only 2 years to negotiate a very complex set of issues or decide how we slice this cake. What do we begin with as first step, but also having a common understanding of what will be the next steps afterwards. And the first meeting is, of course, very important to move this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. All of the issues that you touched upon basically touch on European interests, security interests. That's not a new situation. Europeans were always keen to have a say and have influence on US-Russian nuclear talks. This process, as you said, is likely to be more complicated than in the past. At the same time, NATO will probably embark on discussions on a new strategic concept, which also will involve some of the issues that you spoke about and Sarah spoke about. So the question to pose to Ambassador Schmid is, how can Europeans make sure that their interests, their positions are taken into account when Washington and Moscow meet and talk about these issues? How can NATO incorporate these issues? And on what issues should they prioritize to have an influence on? Thanks again for taking the time. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Oliver, and welcome to everybody. I would like to discuss the issue of NATO's new strategic concept and arms control, because it's important how this will be fixed. It will be paved the way for the next years in this regard. Arms control, and as part of NATO's essential core task, cooperative security, collective defense and crisis management being the other two, is today a central element of the alliance's current strategic concept. And it's my point that it should remain the same in the new one. Where do we stand today? One of the arguments put forward for change in NATO's strategy is the emergence of a different security environment, characterized mainly and often by aggressive Russian intentions and attitudes. That's the starting point. Arms control, however, doesn't deal with intentions and attitudes. Subject matter of arms control are rather objective military capabilities. They represent the security risk a country poses. It may increase, and this is also put forward currently, and causing a security gap with the buildup of such capabilities by one side. In this case, the other side has in principle two options: either also strengthening its defenses by increasing its own capabilities, which could lead to a new buildup of the other side, risking an arms race, creating more instability and an aspect which we know as security dilemma. Or choose an arms control approach, negotiating away, destabilizing over capabilities, and guaranteed by an effective verification system. In doing so, one could use sticks, for instance, threaten a military buildup, and carrot, for instance, assure a non-aggressive level of capabilities. In doing so, this approach should send a clear message to the other side, which concrete level of forces could prevent a reactive military buildup. NATO's current strategic concept is clearly committed to arms control as a means to keep forces at the lowest possible level, beneficial for both sides and always consistent with the alliance's ability to provide for effective collective defense. This positioning is a clear signal not to miscalculate NATO's determination to react, an invitation to equally adopt to the other side, an invitation to adopt a policy of low level of armament that provides for stability for both sides, or to bear the negative consequences of a risky and costly military buildup. Historically, NATO's double decision in the late 60s is a striking and finally successful example of such an approach leading to the INF Treaty. The Wales Declaration in 2014 didn't follow this example. It just stated NATO would strengthen the military capabilities the alliance needs. The Warsaw Declaration and the Brussels Declaration in 2016 and 2018 don't mention the objective of the lowest possible level of forces, expressing instead a more generic and less explicit commitment to arms control. The new strategic concept should, however, maintain the current three-pillar provision on arms control, providing thus, and I quote, the current concept, predictability, transparency, and the means to keep armaments at the lowest possible level for stability. So much the more as the changes in the security environment over the last decade don't hinder effective agreement and implementation of arms control. In order to make the concept's arms control provisions more operational, the new strategy concept should, in case a security gap occurs, provide for a comprehensive assessment of all available avenues, strengthening the defenses on one side and arms control measures on others, as well as possible mixes of both in elaborating a NATO position. Arms control envisaged here would be bilateral and tailor-made to the security needs of both sides. US and Russia in the first front in nuclear arms control, NATO and Russia in conventional one. This has always been the case in nuclear arms control, but there are also examples in conventional arms control where for example, the first CFE treaty was in substance a bilateral agreement between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. In this kind of negotiations, it is essential that all partners are fairly and adequately represented. And this is the question how the European would come in. The current strategic concept foresees provisions to this end, which should be maintained and should be even, and this is a part of the current concept, it could be developed as necessary. And I think it's here where the European side could make their points. As to the inclusion of the greater public to the process of developing the new strategic concept, I think we should be not over-optimistic that this would change from the current exclusion of this public, as we've seen in the last run-up to the strategic concept of 2010. But on the other hand, we had made some progress. The reflection group's findings were published, and I think these could be a basis to accompany the discussion and the negotiations on the future new strategic concept of NATO. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 3 great opening remarks to paint the picture of where we are and where we might go with 3 different perspectives. Thanks to the speakers also for sticking to time. We have half an hour left to discuss these issues, and Pavel Potvik was already very good in asking the first 2 questions. I would like to invite the other participants to also post their questions in the chat so that I can forward them to the speakers. And let me maybe start with Pavel's questions. The first one is what the prospects are for a ban on INF range missiles, including the infamous 9M729 that was the reason for the INF treaties. And as Russia has hinted at, suggested at, and then also the question of how to start such a dialogue, whether verification issues are a good way to start that. And then a third question related to a possible freeze on future deployments. And in the deep cuts statement, if I can just quote that, we suggest that Presidents Biden and Putin encourage other nuclear weapon states to declare a freeze on deployed nuclear warhead numbers as long as Russia and the United States negotiate a new START follow-on agreement. Here, the question is whether there should be a political commitment not to increase the number of deployed, not to decrease the total number of deployed and non-deployed weapons. That was discussed briefly last year. So some suggestions on how to move forward on these issues, how to get a dialogue started. And Andrei is raising his hand, so I give you the floor first. Over to you.
Thank you. Just to react to Pavel's questions, I may be wrong, but I guess it was not a proposal to ban INF range missiles, but to begin with a moratorium on the deployment. This was not explicitly including the Russian missile in question, but Russia was suggesting transparency measures to verify non-deployment of those missiles, specifically in the Kaliningrad region. As to my best knowledge to date, there was no specific response from NATO on that proposal. So having no response, no counter proposal on the NATO side, Russia did not move on this issue so far. Should there be a NATO response on that question? And should this come from the forthcoming summit meeting? This could be on the table and could be subject to the conversations. As for the freeze on the warheads, on the total number of warheads, this was part of the bargaining with the outgoing Trump administration later last year, Russia was prepared to accept the idea, although of course the verification would be very difficult in this case. But Russia was ready to accept this idea, provided the Trump administration would be ready to accept the extension of the New START and the beginning of talks on the follow-up treaty. There was no deal. This is why Moscow at this time would not feel bounded by this kind of no deal with the Trump administration. Should the Biden administration bring this back to the table, this would be subject to conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. Indeed, the October proposal by President Putin, there was no official response, but a lot of skepticism on the idea of a moratorium. Some people pointed out that Russia already is deploying some new systems. Sarah, I'd be interested in your take on this. Is this something that the Biden administration might be willing to engage? There were today again calls by the NATO Secretary General on Russia also to engage in the NATO-Russia Council. There's a difficult agenda there, but how do we get back to substantive discussions also in the NATO-Russia Council? And might the Biden administration be willing to take some of these Russian proposals at face value to start a dialogue? Or what's your impression of where the United States stands on this?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. It's a good question. I was interested to hear Andrei's sort of take on the view from Moscow about where these things look. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is when I'm reading statements from US officials about sort of what the utility of arms control is in the current environment. There's a big emphasis placed on verifiability, in part because I think there's a view, and I think this is a correct view, that is part of the mechanism for shoring up strategic stability and increasing transparency and predictability in the relationship. And so, I actually have open questions myself about the extent to which non-sort of verifiable or politically binding agreements have the potential to lead to something that looks more like verifiable treaty-based arms control. And so in my view, I do think that there is utility to exploring some of these non-legally binding measures, at least initially, to sort of get the ball rolling, to pick up on the points that my co-panelists made. Time is of the essence here. And so just finding a place to begin is something that I think is really important. But it seems pretty clear to me when I'm reading statements from US officials and trying to kind of read the tea leaves that the verifiability of these agreements is something that's going to be really crucial, because that itself serves an important mechanism in increasing transparency and predictability in the US-Russian relationship. So that certainly wouldn't, at least in my view, be the end of the street, but it could potentially provide some kind of a starting point. That's a bit of a vague answer, but again, we're still waiting to see sort of what the position of the new administration will be on a number of these really crucial issues.
Thanks, Sarah. Ambassador Schmid, I don't know whether you want to come in on this, but I'd be interested in your take on whether Europeans should encourage the US particularly to be more open to these kind of informal talks, also taking up some of these offers that many in NATO see as a poison pill. Is that something that we should start a dialogue on, or is it not a good entry point into these kind of issues?
Thank you. I would say that we as Europeans have always supported and arms control as a ways and means to lower tensions, because we are in between geographically and in other regards. So I think arms control, and this I would say to Andrei, who said we have, talking about strategic stability, we have to take into consideration much more issues than we had to take some years ago. This, of course, is true. But on the other hand, arms control has and serves a specific purpose. It brings the military option to solve conflicts down. And I think we should use this. And also with regard to the relationship between Russia and NATO, currently there is a mix-up. There are issues, there's criticism with regard to the military build-up, There's criticism with regard to the behavior of Russia in human rights, in other issues, in respecting international law. I think we should separate both issues, and we should use the avenues arms control is offering us in order to reduce tensions. And I think we have an instrument, and we lost it sometimes in the past, but we gained it back, and this is the NATO-Russia Council. I don't know why we shouldn't start there informal talks on the limited issue of arms control, and not mixing it up with other issues we have to discuss and to solve with Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrei, can I put that question to you? Again, there was in the press, back and forth over the NATO-Russia Council, and NATO basically said we're waiting for Russia to come and meet us in the NATO-Russia Council. Apparently addressing Ukraine is an issue. Should there be conditions attached for getting back to also having informal working level discussions at the NATO-Russia Council as we had before 2014, or should this be started regardless basically of some of the difficulties we have over other issues?
My suggestion was always that we need to move on parallel tracks. We shall not drop the issue of the Ukrainian settlement, but we shall not prevent discussions on important issues until we have settled Ukraine. So that was very much a stumbling block in the discussions with NATO, because the most difficult issue for the limited meetings of the NATO-Russia Council was agreeing on the agenda. I know there are also pretensions on the NATO side, but generally NATO, in the consensus procedure, was not prepared to talk about anything but Ukraine and by briefing Russia on decisions which were taken by NATO. There was no real dialogue on issues, not to speak of issues which Russia would like to put on the agenda. We need to come back to this on whatever level, and one of the important points always raised on the Russian side was, of course, that we need to restore meal-to-meal contacts and communications. This is supported by, I would say, the majority of the non-governmental military experts, but it's a very rigid policy so far by NATO countries, which ban any contacts, meal-to-meal contacts with Russia. I was recently in a conference with colleagues from some NATO member states. I don't quote them by name, but they were explaining to me that they, as militaries, are not allowed to have any meeting with Russian military people in whatever format, formal or informal, in whatever institutional setting, etc. As long as this consensual position of NATO does not change, it will be very difficult to resume talks on issues, and we would have to discuss about the agenda. What will be the concerns on the Russian side? What are the concerns on the NATO side? We need to put it all together on the table and discuss. This is why my question was at the beginning, whether or not seeing changes in the US-Russian dialogue now, at least an attempt to move things. Can I expect to see similar changes on the NATO side linked to the NATO summit meeting? Should there be any opening of NATO toward that kind of discussions with Russia? I do have my doubts so far. Coming back to the INF range question, just adding one more element. There are different options, of course, to address the issue. One option is if INF range missiles, nuclear weaponized missiles, are included on the follow-up agreement between Russia and the US. This may be the ultimate solution of the current dispute. However, I believe it will take us quite a long time. I'm not sure we will be able to manage such a complex agreement, specifically if we go into the tactical nuclear weapons by 2023. This is why I still consider it's important that we do have some interim arrangement on the INF range before we decide ultimately on whether and how to include this on the US-Russian forthcoming agreement, hopefully forthcoming agreement on nuclear weapons, just simply to prevent the resumption of a nuclear arms race in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. How to slice the cake, I think, as you said in the beginning of your introductory remarks, is one of the key questions, I guess. I think a lot of people are expecting some first answers from the Geneva summit. What the baskets might be, to use the old language, on issues. And Sarah, if I can ask you on an issue that has been discussed more over the last couple of months, missile defense, than under the Trump administration, where I think there was an assumption that that's just a non-starter. More recently, there have been some suggestions that missile defenses have to be addressed, maybe not in the sense of reductions, but in the sense of providing at least more transparency and maybe future limitations. Steve Pfeiffer, another commission member, recently wrote also that if Europeans want to address Russian tactical nuclear weapons particularly, they may want to think about whether they want to be willing to talk about missile defenses. NATO has its own missile defense system. So this will be an issue for NATO also. Do you expect there to be more flexibility on the US side in talking about missile defense and making this part of the, I think Russians say, strategic equation of issues, or what's your take on where the United States might stand on this?
That's a great question, Oliver. And I think I mean, for me, it's a particular interest area because in my own scholarship, I've sort of looked at the ways that missile defense might have unintended consequences in terms of, arms control, US-Russia relations, all that kind of thing. I think if we take a historical perspective, there are certainly a number of these that we can point to, particularly in the Russian weapons innovation space. But the missile defense conversation in the United States is complicated. I think I would say in sort of recent years, it has seemed like there's been more bipartisan support than I would have necessarily expected for missile defense. So I think we'll kind of need to see what that conversation looks like, particularly in light of the new Biden administration's budget proposals. I'll be watching very closely to see the way that domestic constituencies, domestic lawmakers and policymakers evaluate and discuss those proposals in the budget. And I think that will really give us some clues as to whether or not there is the potential for some kind of restraint there. So, I think that is something that could be quite useful. I think because Russian policymakers, at least rhetorically, have linked the development of these new novel systems to the US pursuit of ballistic missile defense, there is a rationale for having a very candid conversation about the cost and benefits of pursuing ballistic missile defense in quite the same way that it has been pursued in the United States in the past, but whether or not that will actually enter into sort of the political discourse is something that I think we're going to have to wait and see. But it's definitely, I think the coin of the realm as we go into looking at what the future of New START might be.
Thanks very much. So there's potentially at least an opening here, and I think many in the Deep Cuts Commission also, would like to see this part of the dialogue and to have this addressed. In what way or shape we will see. Andrei wants to come in also, but just a reminder for the participants, we have 10 minutes left. If you want to pose a question or have a comment, now is the time to write it in the chat. Andrei, over to you on missile defense.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to the complexity of the debate over ballistic defenses. Because if I look at the last couple of years, the major concern as articulated by the Russian government with respect to the European ballistic defense was not exactly about ballistic defenses, but about the possibility of using the MK launchers for launching the Tomahawk cruise missiles, not only the interceptors. And of course, no matter whether or not ballistic defenses are included into the general framework of negotiations, in which way, etc., this issue will remain on the agenda by discussing nuclear arms control issues, although this will be rather in the INF range than the strategic weapons. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a question, can't quite see by whom, to Sarah on an issue that's been much discussed, the stated intent by the president, at least ahead of the elections, to reduce the role of nuclear weapons by committing to a sole purpose doctrine. Some even suggest going a step further towards a no first use posture. I'd be very interested in your take, what you think the administration, how serious it is in taking this forward, and also be interested in Ambassador Schmid's view after that, whether Europeans should support this. There's been some arguments that Europeans should be cautious about this because it's contentious among allies. It might undercut the credibility of deterrence in the view of some. But maybe, Sarah, you can first comment on what we can expect on the Biden administration with regard to this election. It's not a promise, or some say probably a warning, but that's something that he stated very clearly in the run-up to the election, that he personally has an interest in. Biden has his history, I guess, on this issue. So yeah, what's your take on sole purpose, Sarah?
So I'm a little wary of sort of engaging in prognostication on this point, because I don't know. Again, we're going to have to wait and see what happens. But one of the things that I think would be important if the Biden administration were interested in, sort of garnering support for this position would be to articulate the ways in which it is different from a no first use policy. I think that there is sometimes a sort of muddying of the waters, perhaps, in the American domestic discourse about what is the line between a sole purpose policy, how is that different from a no first use policy, and which of those two is really in the American national interest, thinking about that from a lot of different perspectives, diverse policymaking perspectives. So I think an important first step will be to see how the new administration talks about sole purpose and how they distinguish that from a no first use policy, or whether or not they actually do that. But I think it's very clear that there's going to need to be a conversation, with U.S. allies. That's going to need to be a conversation that happens with NATO as well. And so, looking at the different steps that the Biden administration could take to sort of reassure European colleagues and folks in European capitals that this will not undercut the credibility of the U.S. extended deterrent is, I think, something that's going to need to happen. And I'll be curious to hear from other co-panelists kind of how that debate looks from other European capitals. So again, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, so over to you, Ambassador Schmid. That's the question.
Yes.
Goes to you, I suppose. Primarily, should Europeans endorse this proposal?
I will be very brief. I think we don't know the concrete proposal yet, but it looks as if it was in line with a proposal to limit as much the possible use of nuclear weapons. And I think this has always been a European position, and specifically a German position. You may remember the first days of Mr. Fischer when he started just with this proposal. So I can't see that we would face major opposition to this on the European, specifically on the German side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since Joschka Fischer tried his hand at no first use, of course, we had commitment also in the NPT by the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in security policies and doctrines. So that has been a step forward, and that's probably another frame from which to see the importance of such a step. There's a question in the chat on an issue we haven't touched upon, broadening participation in the involvement of third parties. China, how does Russia see the future of including China in nuclear arms control, asks Vladimir Handel. But attached to that, there's of course the question of including potentially other nuclear powers, European nuclear powers, but in the future, maybe also nuclear possessor states that are not in the NPT. On what issues, when, and how do you think we can broaden this now bilateral dialogue? Andrei, you want to go first on this?
Thank you. And Vladimir, great to hear from you. My first point would be to say Russia would welcome if China and other nuclear powers would join the process of nuclear arms control. Second, China is not yet prepared to do so, nor are other nuclear powers prepared to join the process. This is why, and generally, if we look at the START framework, I would not see any convincing model of integrating China into the START levels, because you either offer China the same limits on nuclear weapons as an equal participant as the US and Russia have, and this is definitely not in the interest of either Russia or the US. Or we suggest that China accepts discriminatory lower limits on its nuclear forces at the present level, for instance. This is something which would be in the interest of Russia and the US, but something which is not acceptable to China. So we have yet to figure out the way in which we would integrate China and other nuclear powers into the process. We need to talk about this. We have had some discussions within the so-called P5 framework, not very forthcoming so far with respect to integrating them into the arms control, but this is at least some good beginning, at least the only place where we talk about the issues. But I'm firmly convinced that taking the numbers of the US and Russian nuclear weapons, total numbers, we are doomed to make the next step in reductions on the bilateral basis. At the same time, we need to continue talking to China and others, identifying the way how they would join. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Of course, would be interested to hear how the Biden administration will have its position formulated on including China. We have unfortunate history under the Trump administration, which used this argument to, I think, sometimes avoid a serious discussion on nuclear arms control. On what issues do you think the Biden administration may continue to push China to be part of the dialogue on nuclear arms control?
That's a great question. And I don't think, again, it's sort of an unsatisfying answer, but I don't think we have a lot of concrete information about where the Biden administration might seek to engage China. But one of the things that I think is clear, at least from what we've seen preliminarily, is that unlike the previous administration, where there was this interest in pursuing trilateral arms control, the Biden administration seems to have shifted to being interested in pursuing, again, bilateral arms control with Russia, and then also engaging China where that's possible. And we kind of see that differentiation, I think, in some of the statements that we've seen come out of the White House and out of the current administration. So, I think it will depend. We know, of course, that the history of US and Russian arms control is really lengthy and really rich. And so there is this depth of kind of knowledge of how the two sides can work together, whether or not there's the political will to do that. We don't have that similar depth of experience with China. And so we're starting from two very different points there. But I will also be curious to see what further detail we see come out from the Biden administration about exactly which issues on which they hope to engage Beijing.
Ambassador Schmid, the question to you, of course, in this context would have to be, what about the European smaller states? We had a recently step backwards, if you like, from the United Kingdom, which reduced transparency on its nuclear weapons posture and also announced that it would increase the ceiling of its nuclear holdings. What can countries like Germany do to pave the way, or to at least make it more likely that also in Europe, nuclear arms control is something that France and the United Kingdom might want to take part in?
I would just say one word to China. I think Andrei put the difficulties we face there, and my guess is that what we could reach in a reasonable time frame is a moratorium on all sides. And you mentioned the British decision, which wasn't helpful in this regard, to put it this way. And I think, of course, we can target allies to each other, but the final decision lies with the British government.
Thank you very much. We're running up to 5 o'clock. One last question. At the end of next week, if you imagine you're at the end of next week and Biden is going back to Washington, we have these 2 or 3 summits, depending on how you count, behind us. If you had one thing that you would wanted to have out of these week of meetings, summits, what would that be? The one thing that you would really wish would come out of these meetings. Andrei, you want to go first?
I'd wished myself more, but I hope that the best outcome would be a clear signal coming out of the summit meetings, giving green light to begin serious talks on both nuclear and conventional arms control.
Thanks. Sarah?
Thanks. Yeah, I think I would sort of echo what Andrei said. I'd also really hope to just have a clearer understanding of the areas of overlap, shared priorities between the new administration on the US side and in Russia as well. So I'm going to be very attentive to what we see come out of these various summits.
Thank you, Ambassador Schmid.
I'm not far away from these positions. I think we currently face a situation where the discussion between both sides is subject to a blockade. And my hope is that, at least as far as arms control is concerned, we will overcome this, have overcome this at the end of next week.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for watching. Thanks to our 3 panelists for sharing their thoughts and analysis. It's nice to be talking about these things again after at least 4 years of regress with the option of making progress. That's certainly a possible change, and we hope to work on these issues over the coming months and years. Please continue to follow the Deep Cuts Commission activities. You can follow us on Twitter. We have a website. I would like to thank also my colleagues Franziska Sterk and particularly Maren Vilo for organizing this, making sure this worked as smoothly as it did. We will post a recording of this on our website soon. So if you want to see a replay or if you missed parts of the conversation, feel free to take a look there. Otherwise, I hope you're all stay safe and well. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you all soon in person or at least virtually. Have a good day. And thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.